when one preaches the word, they can sound unkind and judgmental. I did last week. I preached the word. I sounded unkind and judgmental. So let me briefly recap for you. Matthew 5:17, if you're open there, we'll read that together. But I want to recap Matthew 5:17 and how we read it and interpreted it based on Scripture instead of based on what we wish it might have said. Come on. We hope it might say something, but that's not the way you interpret Scripture. You have to let it interpret itself. Matthew 5:17 says this, "Think not or do not think that I am come to destroy the law or the prophets. I am not come to destroy, but to fulfill. For verily I say unto you, till heaven and earth pass, one jot or one tittle shall in no wise pass from the law till all be fulfilled." Heaven and earth have not passed. The law still stands. "Whosoever therefore, since the law still stands, whosoever therefore shall break one of these least commandments and shall teach men so, he shall be called the least in the kingdom of heaven. But whosoever shall do and teach them, the same shall be called great in the kingdom of heaven." Last Sabbath, we discussed the play on words used by Yeshua here brilliantly. We discussed the context. We also used Matthew chapter 7, verse 21 through 23 to properly interpret Matthew 5:19. And that proper interpretation of Matthew 5:19 is this. Matthew 5:19 does not say that those who break the least commandments and teaches others to do so will get into the kingdom, but they'll be called the least. It's not what it teaches. That may be what we wished it taught. That may be what we would hope it would teach, but it does not teach that. It is saying that those who do such things are making an eternally fatal mistake, and they will not get into the kingdom. Matthew 5:19 is saying the exact same thing as Matthew 7:23. Yeshua said both things at the same time. It took 2 chapters to record it, 3 chapters to record it, Matthew 5, Matthew 6, Matthew 7. But he said the exact same thing in Matthew 5:19 as he said in Matthew 7:23, which is there will come a time that he will say to those who are anomia, who are fighting against, resisting Torah, he will say to them, "Depart from me, for I know you not." That sounds unkind and it sounds judgmental, but it's not. It's just the word. After last Sabbath, Spencer and I later had a discussion. He asked me a very prudent, very logical, and very penetrating question. His question was, well, where does the scale tip? How much of Torah do you not have to do before it tips over into that area of, okay, you're not getting in? That's a very legitimate question. Enoch 41:1 says the actions of men are weighed in the balance. So how much have you got to not do to not get in? How much have you got to do to get in? Where does the scale tip? Matthew 5:19 says, "He that breaks the least shall not enter." So what can that possibly mean? He has a legitimate concern, and his question should be heard and wrestled with by anyone who is in pursuit of truth. His question lingered with me for days. And his question requires that we examine this subject more fully before moving on to verse 3 in chapter 41. So allow me, if you would, to refresh your memory of last Sabbath's conclusion again concerning Matthew 5:19. Yeshua said that those who break the least, and by using the word least, he was saying that there are some who see commandments as being insignificant. Some part of Torah is being insignificant. They take certain commandments and say these are insignificant. And so they have determined they're insignificant, and so they break them. We listed some of the commandments that many consider to be insignificant. Do you remember what they were? The top 3 that we said most people determined to be insignificant? Dietary laws, Sabbath laws, and Moedim. Okay? Concerning them, Yeshua said, those who break the least, whichever ones it is they consider to be the least, shall be called least in the kingdom of heaven. Now, when you read that in like today's English version or the Good News Bible, they translate it this way: they will be least in the kingdom of heaven. But that's inaccurate. That's a poor translation. That's not what it says. It said they will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. And there's that play on words we were talking about. These that Yeshua is focused on called some part of Torah insignificant, and they broke it. And Yeshua said, there's coming a day the kingdom of heaven will call them insignificant. They can't look at his instruction and say, that's insignificant, and expect to enter into the kingdom of heaven. The kingdom of heaven will look at them and say, no, you are the one that's insignificant. They thought Torah or some part of Torah was least insignificant. They're not allowed into the kingdom. The kingdom calls them insignificant. That sounds unkind and judgmental. Take it up with Yeshua. And it certainly, though, that statement certainly elicits this question: where does the scale tip then? Allow me to present to you what I see that tips the scale. He asked a legitimate question we ought to search for answers. Let me begin with what is in the text itself. Matthew chapter 5, I think the very next verse presents to us a proper interpretation of verse 19, and it helps us to understand what tips the scale. Matthew 5:20 says this, "For I say unto you, that except your righteousness shall exceed the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees, you shall in no case, there's not a case you can bring up, you shall in no case enter into the kingdom of heaven." You shall not enter. That's what it says. So verse 19 is not saying they get in, but just barely. Verse 20 begins with this word. It begins with the word "for." That word is used to say, I said this in verse 19, now I'm going to tell you the reason that I said what I said in verse 19. Yeshua says in verse 20, I said what I said so that you will understand that you're not going to enter the kingdom of heaven if your righteousness does not exceed that of the scribes and the Pharisees. Who are the scribes and Pharisees? I mean, if he's saying, okay, you want something to measure by, here it is. Here are the scribes and the Pharisees. You want to get into the kingdom of heaven, your righteousness has to exceed their righteousness. So who are the scribes and the Pharisees? But let me help you with that answer. If you ever want to know who they are, who Yeshua considered them to be, not who they considered themselves to be. Because he said, you seek honor from one another. And so they honored one another. So it's not who they considered themselves to be, but if you ever want to know who Yeshua considered them to be, read Mark chapter 7. Why don't you go there right now? Mark chapter 7, verse 5. Then the Pharisees and scribes, so there they are. The Pharisees and scribes asked him, why walk not your disciples according to the tradition of the elders, but eat bread with unwashed hands? So we're not talking about Torah, we're talking about the tradition of the elders. Right. And they said, your disciples don't keep these traditions. Their concern is not Torah. Their concern is not obedience to Torah. Their concern is the tradition of the elders, the rules and the regulations that they had set up that they thought would demonstrate righteousness. The scriptures tell.
Now, this is talking about not washing washing hands and whatever, and that's a tradition of men. But as what I found, you could go to Matthew 23 and you can see what Messiah said about the scribes and the Pharisees, and that they're hypocrites, and they are liars, and they are unalivers, and they are of the synagogue of Hasatan, and all a bunch of, vipers and really bad things. But going off on traditions, keep in mind about what I have been finding in my studies on the calendar. They also changed the calendar. They also made up their traditions of men and changed the Yah's calendar to a lunar calendar, which is false. And they also changed when a day starts. They added feasts like Purim and Hanukkah and all the bad stuff, and they're thus, breaking Torah. And a lot of believers blindly follow them and their traditions. So just keep that in mind when you're listening to this.
Plus that they went about to establish their own righteousness. When you forsake Torah, you got to come up with other rules and regulations to demonstrate your righteousness. Come on. Listen to Yeshua's condemnation of them and of their religion. He answered and said unto the scribes and Pharisees, well, has Isaiah prophesied of you hypocrites? As it is written, this people honors me with their lips, but where's their heart? Far from me. So just because someone shows up every Sunday doesn't mean they're close to the Father. Just because someone says they love God and they love Jesus doesn't mean they're close to the Father. Yeshua called them actors. That's what the word hypocrite means. That is, they're ones who learned the script they were given and they play the role of being somebody who worships God. Boy, I said a bunch right there. Their denomination gave them a script, said if you do these things, it demonstrates you love God and you love Jesus. And so they do those things. Yeshua called them hypocrites. They honor Yahweh with their lips, but their heart's far from him. What determines if one's heart is connected to the Father as opposed to one whose heart is far from the Father? He says it over and over again. If you love me, and there's the relationship, right? If you love me,